All right. So one thing that made me a little bit sad about this question when I saw from 2018 or 2019, whenever it was, that people got it wrong, was that the most common answer was the line that was parallel. So that was something that was kind of annoying to me. Is that a lot of people read this question, did everything right, and then realized that the final answer was parallel. And so that was something that was just kind of frustrating because a lot of people um, had the right idea, they just didn't do it correctly. So this one, the first thing that you need to do is identify what the important parts of the question are. Obviously, it gives us a picture of the graph, it gives us a picture of the line. It tells us what I'm looking for, something being perpendicular. And then basically it wants me to figure out what a possible equation could be. So the thing that we need to pay attention to is what the slope is for the first equation, right? Or for the first one. Now it's really, really nice because they're actually saving us time on these questions by giving us the picture, right? If they didn't give us a picture, they said something like, well, you have a line that goes through the point 0, -5, and 0, +3, whatever. That's something that would have been really, really nice to have a way to find the slope quickly, which they gave it to us, which they didn't have to. So this is just a couple things to think about as you're going through the SAT, wherever you can find ways to save time. Can't speak. Whenever you can find ways to save time, use those. So like this, don't go out of your way to find what the slope is any other way than just saying we go up 3/5, right? That tells me right now that my slope is 3/5. Now, there are a couple other conversations I could hear when you guys were working through this that also makes me a little bit leery. How do you find the slope of a perpendicular line? Opposite reciprocal, right? So it has to be flipped. So we have to take the opposite and flip it. So basically this question is saying, which of the four equations at the bottom have a slope of -5/3? Now, one of the other things that I try to explain as much as possible is when you're solving these problems, pay attention to what's important. Don't pay attention to the little stuff that doesn't actually make a difference. All right. So when I do these problems, I know that I'm looking from A through D right now is which one has a slope of -5/3. That's my job. That's what I'm looking for. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically just going to go through each of these equations just far enough to find what the slope is. Because if I can go just far enough to find what the slope is, that will give me everything I need to know. I don't care about the y-intercept. I don't care about the rest of this question. I care about the slope because then I can start crossing off answers that are no good, right? So I'm going to start with one of the other ones because the answer is actually A. For those of you that A is the answer. I'm going to start with one of these other ones because I want to show you what my process would look like if we didn't start with one that was the correct answer. So this one right here, the first thing that I would do is I would rewrite this in terms of y equals mx plus b. Every single person in here should be able to make this equation happen in one step, right? You're moving everything over, you're keeping the y by itself, you're just solving this equation for y. Now we're going to divide by -3. And I don't care about this. So this is something that you have to think about with the SAT. Don't think about this. Think about this thing, which tells me that this slope is 5/3. Now we're pretty close. We're not exactly right. Now what I would do if this were me looking at this problem, and again, these are just tips and tricks that you pick up after doing this for a long, long time. I can see that this thing produced a slope that is pretty dang close to what I'm looking for, right? I want it to be -5/3. It was +5/3. So if I can tell that this answer is no good, but it produced the right 5/3 thing, it might be a pretty solid guess to think, well, maybe it's this one. Because as you compare A and B together, X and the coefficients in front of the X and the coefficients in front of the Y's are the exact same, right? So that means that this should produce a 5/3, but since one of the symbols is different, positive to negative, it should probably mean that it's going to become the opposite, right? So as you kind of work through these things, just think, what can I do to save time? What can I do to maybe give me a better hint? So like this one, I could say, okay, well, B is not the answer, but A is the closest thing to B, and B was already kind of close, so maybe let's try A. So this one for A, when I simplify, it's going to end up being 3y equals negative 5x minus 3 divided by 3 divided by 3. And now all of a sudden I've got my slope of negative 5/3, which is exactly what I want to have, right? So as you look through this stuff, I hope that you can try to find ways that will make it easier. You'll find ways that you can then cross off answers that are bad, make sure that you get rid of answers that you don't want. But the big thing with these questions is you have to start with the vocab. You have to start understanding what question you're trying to ask first, right? They're asking you the question about something being perpendicular. If you don't know that perpendicular is opposite reciprocal, you're toast. You can't do anything anyway, right? So just make sure that you understand what these vocab words are. And if you don't know them, don't waste your time on it, right? If this thing is asking you to find perpendicular and you don't know what perpendicular is, put a little star by this question and move on and come back to it later. Because if you don't know perpendicular, then you're going to spend 5 minutes trying to think about something being a perpendicular line, even though you don't know how to find it, right? So this is how I would have done it when I was in high school. When I had the same level of education that you guys had. Now that I'm an algebra teacher, I obviously have picked up different tips and tricks and ways to do things over the course of my career. What I would do if this were me right now is I would understand that my job or my goal is to get my equation into one of these forms. Now, obviously, we've come up with our slope of 3/5 the same way that I would have. I would have then said, okay, that means that the perpendicular slope is going to be negative 5/3. So then I'm saying we've got y equals negative 5/3 x plus b. That's something that everyone in here is capable of, right? But I know right now that my equation is not in the right form. So basically what I'm saying is if this is the equation of a perpendicular line, can I rewrite this in terms of x plus y plus something equals 0 and make it look the same? So let's try. So my goal would be to add 5/3 and to subtract b from both sides. So add 5/3 and subtract b from both sides. And again, if you don't want to do it this way, don't do it this way. This is just the way that I would look at it. So now I've got an x plus y, and if I wanted to get rid of that fraction, all I would have to do with this fraction is multiply by 3. 3 times 5/3 becomes 5. 3 times 3 becomes 3. 3 times negative b, don't really care about this, but it becomes 3b. So basically I'm saying any of the equations that start off with 5x plus 3y equals something would give me the equation, and again, that's going to be it. All right, so that's how I would look at this problem if it were me going through it. You know, each person is going to look at these questions a little bit differently. Start with the vocab. Make sure you understand the vocab. Questions or issues with this one that started out first? You guys have any questions or issues or things that you want to talk about for the SAT before I just kind of dominate the conversation to keep giving you questions? Yeah.
Well, not like for like this problem.
Yeah.
So how can you just eliminate C and D?
For what purpose? Like how?
Like with the last term.
I don't know what you mean. Like you mean the fact that it says plus 15 or minus 15? Not necessarily, because, well, at least I don't know that I could. Because the only thing that that's doing is that's really telling you where the y-intercept is. So if you were to set each of these into y equals form, this one would produce a y-intercept of -3. This one would produce a y-intercept of +3. This one would be -3. So this is just saying that the line would go through this point. That doesn't necessarily cancel out the fact that it's going to be perpendicular, because I could still have a line that's perpendicular that goes through that spot. That all still depends on the slope. So really, these pieces of information are very unimportant at all, because it doesn't matter where the y-intercept is. It just matters if it's perpendicular, and that's all it's slope. Good question. Any other questions or issues? All right, so the next one that I wanted you guys to look at was this one. I'll give you a couple minutes to try to work on it on your own. This is a with calculator question. This is a question that I think a lot of people are going to look at, and they're going to be able to get pretty close to the answer. But it's also, if you notice, gridded response. Right? So this is also a gridded response question. So give this a little bit. It might take you a little bit longer right now. So I'm probably going to give 2 to 3 minutes, which that should be the amount of time that you spend on these types of questions anyway on SAT. 2 to 3 minutes max. You know, if you think about just the general math, there's 38 questions in 55 minutes. So that puts you somewhere in the ballpark of like a minute and a half a question. That number is a 10, right? So that number on the hypotenuse is a 10.
What's the number by the A? That's the.
That's a theta. It's this, that's this thing. It's just a variable. Theta is just a variable. All right, so I'll give you guys a minute to just try this out, see what you can come up with, and then we'll go through it again together. So let me start out by saying that this question, it was really frustrating for me in the way that SAT asked this question. And the reason that it was really frustrating is because I think a lot of people, you know, with gridded response, if you got an answer of 9.2, that means you knew how to do the math, but you would have gotten the question wrong. So if you got an answer of 9.16 or 9.2 or whatever it was, you would have gotten the question wrong, but you still didn't, you knew how to do the math. And that's the thing that is really frustrating to me, because SAT finds a way to ask questions that are not super challenging, but the way that they ask the questions make the answer very challenging. So that was something that was really frustrating. So if you got an answer of 84, the answer was right. But if you got 9.2 something, the answer was wrong. And that's really frustrating to me, because like, I think when I combined the number of people who got like 84 and 9.2, it was something like 70% last year. Got it right. But like 50% of the people put 9.2. So it shows that people understood the math behind it. They just didn't really know how to do it. So that was kind of frustrating. But there were a couple different ways. This being a with calculator question was actually the reason I think a lot of people got it wrong. But a couple different ways to do this. The way that most of you probably did it was you probably figured out what this angle was first by using sine of theta equals 2/5. So you use inverse sine to find out what the angle was. Then when you use the inverse of the angle, you could find out this side, whatever. That's not really a necessary step. It's more of a time waster than an absolutely necessary step. The way to think about this is, if I ignored the fact that this existed for right now, the words, and if I paid attention only to this, I could call this thing my x value, and I could say that on my triangle, sine of theta is equal to x over 10, right? So based on my triangle, based on right triangle trig, based on SOHCAHTOA, I could say that sine of theta is equal to x over 10. Now, I can also compare that sine of theta and sine of theta are equal to each other. So using substitution, I could say x over 10 is equal to 2 over 5. So what could x equal in this case? Good, everybody. Nice job. Simple math. There you go. So x equals 4. So that tells me the length of that side. All right. With the length of that side, I can automatically tell that 2 of my sides are given to me. One was just given in a kind of a strange way. This was given to me. It was just given to me in kind of disguise. And now I can find the length of that third side. How am I going to find the length of that third side? Just with Pythagorean theorem, right? I can say that AC squared plus 4 squared equals 10 squared, which will be AC squared equals 16, equals plus 16. Equals 100. I can't write. I did it again. I don't care. I don't even care. AC squared equals 84. And now I take the square root and the square root. This is where the issue comes in if you have a calculator in your hand. Because a lot of people, what they're going to see is that the square root of 84 is just a number. Since it's not gridded response, you're not given a set of answers that you're supposed to choose from. You're just supposed to type that into your calculator, get 9.16 and move on. That's what's tough. Because if you think about the way the question is asking you, it says if AC equals the square root of n, and if AC is equal to the square root of 64, then basically it's telling you that the square root of n is equal to the square root of 84 by 60. Square root of 84. What is n? N is 84. That's the part about this that's tricky. And that's also one of the reasons that they give you your calculator for this, because one, they want you to waste time by using your calculator to use sine, cosine, and tangent and use the trig function to find the value, which you should find the value is pretty much just double 2/5 anyway. And then the second thing is they're looking at the square root and they're asking you to find the square root of something, even though you don't need to find the square root of something. And if you didn't have your calculator, you wouldn't really have any other option. You just kind of do your thing, right? But in this case, you'd have to break it down. You have to just look at what the question is asking you and then, you know, answer the question that. Any questions on this or issues on this or concerns on this or anything? One thing got brought up in my third hour that I thought was a really, really important idea. And people were asking me questions like, could I just measure the picture that the SAT gives me? And you're not allowed to have a ruler, but it kind of brought an important idea. The SAT will always tell you that their pictures are not drawn to scale, which, like, if you watch me draw a picture, like in my geometry classes, my pictures aren't even close to scale, like not even sort of close. The SAT will claim that these things are not to scale, but I would bet you that 99% of the time, the SAT's pictures are to scale. They're drawn accurately, they're drawn pretty close. So whatever you guys found to be theta, does anyone find theta? Does anyone find what that angle is? 23.58. 23.58. This looks pretty close to a 23-degree angle. You know, I mean, it may not be perfect, but if you think of, like, if this is a 90-degree angle, that would mean that this is a 45-degree angle, which would mean that half of that is about 22.5, which is pretty close to what Colin just said. So these pictures are pretty close to accurate with their scale. Again, this side length is 4. This side length looks like it's about half, maybe a little bit less than the hypotenuse, which was 10. So one thing to kind of think about in these questions that have pictures with them, if you don't know what to do, make an educated guess based on what the picture shows you. So one of the things that I saw, one of the tips that I had seen was something asked a question like, if the area of the circle is 50, I don't know what it is. So actually, let's say 100. So like if the area of the circle is 100 and this much of the circle is shaded in, what is the area of the shaded section? Now I gave you like 4 questions or 4 answers. So this is a multiple choice question. And you know, a lot of people wouldn't know what to do or figure out the area of the sector and then figure out the area of the triangle and subtract it from the area of the sector. That's kind of a time waster for a lot of things. But if I were to look at this question and say, well, about a quarter of that circle is filled in. So that means that it's somewhere around 25, right? And then it's got to be just a little bit less than 25. So maybe my educated guess would be somewhere around like 22, whatever it is. This is a really good way to kind of educated guess yourself into something that actually makes sense. And I'm talking if you're clueless, if you don't know what's happening, if you have, like, if you're looking at this picture and go, I don't even know where to start with that. And if you gave me 10 minutes, I wouldn't be able to figure it out. Use the picture to give yourself a guess. And if you can at least use the picture to give yourself a guess, there's like a 99% chance that that picture is drawn pretty accurate. Doesn't mean your answer is going to be right, but it means that the pictures are usually drawn pretty close, even though they claim they're not. Okay, that's what I've seen most of the time. Now, go figure, this time they're going to send you a picture and the picture isn't even going to be sort of close. You're going to come back and yell at me because things didn't look the same. But every SAT that I've looked at that says the picture is not drawn to scale is pretty dang close to perfect scale. All right. So here's another question that I want you guys to work through. Oops. There we go. This is one of the questions that was really tough for me to see that people got wrong because it's all a terminology question. This one requires almost no work. So again, this is one of those questions that I'm really hoping you don't spend 5 minutes on this question, because obviously, even without looking at the question at all, right? I'm not even looking at the question at all. A, B, C, and D are almost identical. The only thing that isn't the same is that B has a plus sign there instead of a minus sign, right? This question is essentially asking you, what does the symbol look like? Is it going to be a less than symbol, a greater than symbol, or an equal to symbol? Now, there's a couple context clues that you can kind of give yourself just from looking at the way that the question is written. There's only 2 that are the same, and that's B and D, right? Most of the time that you guys are looking at questions like this, you can assume that B and D are going to provide the right answer. So if you look at this, you can see that B and D have the same symbol. Everything about them is the same, except for the fact that there's a plus and a minus. So if I were guessing on this and I didn't know which one was the right one, I would say that the answer would likely be B or D because they're the only two that you can get tricked on, right? So if I eliminated A and C, that's fine. But now as I continue on this process, it says that at the next part that the temperature is at least 4 degrees Celsius lower than the average. It goes on to tell you that the average is X. And so if a temperature is 4 degrees less than X, that means you're doing X minus 4, which would lead me to believe that my answer is D. Okay. Now, that being said, I wouldn't expect that to be your thought process for the way that you solve this problem. I would expect you to look at this and say, well, it's 4 degrees lower, which would mean X minus 4. So that should mean that A, C, or D is going to give me the right answer. And then I don't know what grade you learned at least or at most or fewer than or anything like that, but at least always means less than or equal to, right? So you should know that this is Y is less than or equal to X minus 4. Questions, issues, concerns on that one? Just terminology. I use this as an example to show you what it looks like when answers can be kind of the same, but not really. Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to trick you. And to be honest with you, it worked because one of the most common misanswered, I guess, incorrectly provided answers was B. People just saw the less than or equal to, they selected B and they moved on. Remember, it's important to read the whole question and to know what the question is asking you, but it's also important to make sure that you're saving time where time is able to be saved. And then I think this is the last one that I'm going to go through today. This is a no calculator question. Okay, so this is a no calc question. So again, since the quadratic formula is not there for you, make sure that you know it. Quadratic formula is the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. Now, when I plug that in, I'm going to get the opposite of B, which is going to be -6 plus or minus the square root of B squared, which is going to be 36 minus 4 times 4 times 1 all over 2 times A, which is going to be 2 times 4. So this will simplify down to -6 plus or minus the square root of 36 minus 16 is 20. Oops. All over 2 times A, which gave me 8. So now this is a question that was kind of a lot, but it really isn't that challenging, in all honesty. Because it's all stuff that you should know how to do. This is stuff that I would put on a test and I would have no issue asking you any of these questions at all. So this is something where we have to break down the square root of 20 as the square root of 4 and the square root of 5, which would be 2 square roots of 5. And again, that's a question that I've asked you before. You've seen this, you've done this. So now it turns into -6 plus or minus 2 square roots of 5 all over 8. And we should be able to see that 2 will go into all of these numbers right here, which will then make it -6 divided by 2 is -3. 2 divided by 2 is 1, so that will disappear. And then 8 divided by 2 is 4, so that will turn into that. Now, obviously, they don't give you any plus or any minus, it's just a plus. So the answer to this one is going to be. All right, we'll pick up more on these tomorrow. If you guys have questions, bring them to me so that we can work through them together. Otherwise, it's just going to be more of the same thing, just like this, where we go through more and more answers. Ask questions if you got them.